The First World War, a conflict that devoured men like no other. A new horror of automated fighting and killing. For the first time in history, death came en masse. When the guns finally fell silent, the world would never look the same again. World War I, the conflict that pitted 20th century war machines against 19th century tactics. The images of young men blindly walking into hails of machine gun fire summed up the barbarity of modern trench warfare. At its height, millions threw their bodies against the might of cannon fire and bullet, all in the pursuit of a few yards gained. Over 4 cataclysmic years, the world's great powers, assembled in 2 opposing forces, waged war across the planet. 70 million military personnel were mobilized. New technology fueled the lethality of weapons, and without equivalent improvements in defense or tactics, the generals resorted to mass human wave attacks. By the war's end, almost 10 million military personnel had been killed. Whole nations mourned the dead, the missing, and disabled. Returning soldiers brought home with them severe mental trauma. Each nation involved has been scarred deeply, leaving a lasting impact on social memory. Such collective trauma destroyed optimism and created a term for those that had fought in the war: the lost generation. These are the bare facts, remembered so they can't be forgotten. But within all this and amid such tumultuous times, the human element can get lost. Recently restored German archive, much of it never before seen, catapults us back and lifts the veil on the people and times where death was reduced to a mere blowing of a whistle. Some wars name themselves. This is the Great War. Berlin, 1914. No sign of the nightmare that lies ahead. This is the capital of an aspiring empire, an industrial, technological and scientific giant with a rapidly growing economy and confidence to flex its newly found military might. Foreign soldiers hadn't set foot on German soil since Napoleonic times. To our eyes, these scenes look innocent, the unaware sleepwalking towards total war. But the early 20th century was considered modern times too. The car was met with exuberant enthusiasm. Speed was the drug of the day, petrol its driving force. Germany was the second strongest industrial power in the world, behind only the USA, and she was armed to the teeth. With a robust welfare state, German workers enjoyed unparalleled health, accident and maternity benefits. There was even a national pension scheme. Life, it seemed, could not be better. London, the centre of the known world and the heart of the vast British Empire, where the sun never sets. June the 3rd, 1914, trooping the colour to honour the birthday of King George V. Full pomp and regalia on show. Across Europe, with many of Europe's rulers closely related, the glitz of the old world was played out, the death throes of an outmoded system. King George V visited Berlin to meet his cousin, the German Emperor Wilhelm II. The occasion is the wedding of Wilhelm's daughter Victoria. His other cousin, the Russian Tsar Nicholas, has also come. For now, only gun salutes. Berlin, June the 29th, 1914. The day's headlines report a disturbing event. The Austrian heir to the throne, murdered yesterday. Gavrilo Princip, demanding an end to Serbian interference in Bosnia, assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, Sofia, in Sarajevo, Bosnia. But the significance of the event had yet to be truly realized.
It wasn't immediately thought of that this is now going to be, this is the start of a major conflagration in Europe. And the English politician, or a British politician rather, Lord George said later on that the European nations, I think the phrase was, slithered over the edge into the cauldron of war.
Franz Ferdinand's death caused little mourning. In Germany, holidays were enjoyed at the lakes and Baltic Sea. A village fair in Gaggenau in Swabia. The concept and reality of total war seem a million miles away. And still, life continues. Horse racing at Ludwigslust. Mecklenburg high society show off their finest wardrobe. A perfect summer. But these are the last few days of an entire era. Within weeks, this generation will be thrown into the cauldron of World War. Summer 1914. Prelude to the Great War. The world sleepwalks into mayhem. The royals across Europe seem unconcerned by the recent assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, Bosnia. The German Kaiser, Wilhelm II, holidayed in Norway on his yacht, Hohenzollern. Behind the scenes, diplomatic maneuvering between Britain, Austria-Hungary, Germany, Russia and France failed to calm nerves and culminated in what was to be called the July Crisis.
For a very long time, historical research was concentrated on Germany when we discussed the outbreak of the First World War in summer 1914. We now, I think, have moved away from that concentration on Germany, and we know now that it was the responsibility of all great powers, almost all great powers. All great powers contributed to the outbreak of the First World War, and we now know that in every capital of Europe, the general staffs, the prime ministers, the monarchs were playing with fire.
The Central Powers of Germany and Austro-Hungary were the first to cross the Red Line. 4 weeks after the assassination in Sarajevo, Austria declared war on Serbia. As a result, Serbia's ally, Russia, began to mobilize. To preempt an attack, Germany declared war on Russia, and 2 days later, on the Russian ally, France. The die had been cast.
They all thought this would be an easy war, quickly won, over within a very short time, and everything would go on, and there'd be a sort of cleansing effect through this war. This is a curious notion, that this idea that war would have a cleansing effect on Europe.
August the 1st, 1914. On this fateful day, Germany declared war on Russia. Kaiser Wilhelm II addressed his people.
Es muss denn das Schwert nun entscheiden. Mitten im Frieden überfällt uns der Feind. Darum auf zu den Waffen. Jedes Schwanken, jedes Zögern, der Verrat am Vaterlande.
Odeonsplatz, Munich, a patriotic frenzy. It was now too late to question why the assassination of an unpopular Austrian royal could propel the world into war. But with 5 imperial powers so tightly packed together in continental Europe, perhaps it was inevitable. Either way, war it was. Soldiers on their way to the front. Few could have experienced such jubilant crowds. The enthusiasm was never as deep and overwhelming as when the men marched confidently to war. Across Europe, similar scenes unfolded. In Vienna, mobilization for the war with Serbia. In Paris, the foe would be France's sworn enemy, Germany. Tender farewells, a chance to acquire hero status, even for a day. Most soldiers believed they'd be back home by Christmas, and the German military strategists agreed. Speed was their only chance of victory, because Germany was already in a predicament.
The Germans always tried to prevent a war at 2 fronts. This was what Bismarck tried to prevent in the 1880s, then his successors in the 1890s. So for the Germans it was quite clear you can't win a war at 2 fronts in the West and the East. But then in 1914 this was exactly what happened. So you had Britain and France in the West, Russia in the East. So the strategic situation could not have been worse.
The aim was first to defeat France, then Russia. The German General Staff would put into action the Schlieffen Plan, a rapid, large-scale invasion through neutral Belgium, to deliver a devastating strike to the French army coming from the north. August the 4th, 1914. German troops invaded Belgium. As this breached international laws, Britain delivered an ultimatum, stating that Belgium had to be kept neutral. On the front, the German army received a rude awakening. Unexpectedly, the Belgians put up a spirited resistance.
The
Germans didn't expect the Belgians to put up any resistance, not least because both politicians and military strategists had said that Belgium isn't the main target. And the Belgian army is a vanishing opposition. They called them chocolate box soldiers.
The British acted. On the 4th of August, in response to an unsatisfactory reply that Belgium be kept neutral, Britain declared war on Germany. Up to that point, Germany and Britain had never been at war with one another. No British soldier had set foot on the West European mainland for 100 years. Still thinking in terms of cavalry warfare, the British had sharpened their swords in anticipation. But this war would be different. Unlike any that had gone before, a war without bounds, this was an automated war. For the first time, death came from the air. It was killing on an industrial scale. Suddenly, the true horror was realized, and the conflict had only just begun. August 1914. Across continental Europe, 5 major imperial powers had mobilized their armies. The Allies, United Kingdom, France, and the Russian Empire prepared for combat against the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. 70 million military personnel were mobilized. Germany had already invaded Belgium and was surprised by the ferocity of its defense.
The level of death and destruction, the use of modern technology in the war was on a scale that had been unimaginable. And the experience of the soldiers then, of these went bright and breezily into the war, very rapidly turned into this the abject horror.
August the 6th, 1914, Belgium. Dying en masse begins gradually. On a beautiful summer's day, small skirmishes break out near Liège. These are a unique testimonial of that day. Glass plates found by accident in a flea market. These are the first fallen men, the first of millions. The priest in the village Votem had asked to have the dead photographed for identification purposes later.
You look death in the eye, it's the faces of war, and it is really what war does to people. War is a business of killing people, and that's the only business it is.
But this is how the families wanted to remember their dead, young and bursting with life. The reality of war is very different.
Someone tried to give an image of the people killed, and therefore almost of the act of killing. Just imagine if it had continued like that, we would end up now with 10 million identification images, pictures, photographs, portraits of death.
The German offensive. To die for your fatherland is sweet and honorable, they've been told. They marched 40 kilometers a day in sweltering heat. They didn't drink the water from the wells for fear the Belgians had poisoned them. Consequently, no wine cellar was safe, and there were many of those in Belgium. Control posts sprang up everywhere. Rumors circulated that Belgian civilians were ambushing and shooting Germans.
The fear was grounded in the fact that modern infantry weapons in 1914 had a range of 1,600 meters, sometimes a little more. So from that distance, it was completely impossible to tell who'd been shooting. Even from 1,000 meters, it's impossible to tell. Is he wearing a uniform or not?
Belgian windmills were suspected hideouts for snipers, figments of the fertile imagination of inexperienced troops. "19th of August, German units arrived at the Belgian university town of Louvain. The inhabitants were to surrender all their weapons or face the death penalty. The imperial troops took to their quarters, and a curfew was imposed after 8 p.m. On the evening of the 25th of August, German soldiers manned a control post at the edge of Louvain. They reported shots heard in the darkness and again suspected sniper fire. In response, the soldiers fired indiscriminately into the windows. They then burned down the majestic townhouses of Louvain. They called it a criminal tribunal. Even the pride of the town, its medieval library, fell victim to the flames, including its 230,000 valuable books. By the morning, the heart of the city had been razed to the ground. Yet the business of war continued, oblivious to the devastation. But what triggered the nighttime shooting? It's now clear that it wasn't the Belgian resistance. More likely, nervous German soldiers accidentally shooting at each other. Friendly fire.
There are a number of proven cases where German soldiers demonstrably shot at each other. The soldiers know it and the officers write about it in their own private letters and private war diaries.
But the citizens of Louvain were the ones who paid the price. Over 200 were executed without proof or court processes. Men were taken to Germany as forced labor. The Louvain massacre was a catastrophe, even for the Germans. If Allied propaganda needed a monster, it had one, and they exploited it to the full. The enemy was now called the Hun, or Boche, pigs in French. The spiked helmet became a dark symbol, synonymous with German aggression and hate.
In the old days, great powers waged war as somehow a bit as gentlemen. They regarded themselves as being equal. And in this understanding, the First World War was very different. So the great powers did not regard themselves as equal. The opponent was something very evil. It was something like fighting against the beast. You must win the war. You must defeat the enemy. There's no solution for that. And this is the reason, this perception, this power of perception is the reason why there was no peace in 1915, no peace in 1916. It was this striving for final victory, for final defeat of the enemy.
German counter-propaganda, awkward attempts to paint the men in spiked helmets as family-loving gentlemen. Good people here, spare them, writes the soldier. The truth was somewhat different. and the damage had already been inflicted. The Germans entered Brussels. By the end of August 1914, Belgium was defeated. The German army had a taste for blood. There was now only one natural obstacle separating the German army from Paris, the Marne River in northern France. During skirmishes, the Germans retained the upper hand. Thousands of French soldiers were taken captive. By the end of August 1914, victory in the West seemed a virtual certainty for the German Empire. At least, that was the opinion of the German Supreme Army Command. And they made a fateful decision. 2 entire army divisions were removed from the fighting in France and loaded onto trains heading for the eastern border of the German Empire. The Russian Empire mobilized its armies faster than expected and had already entered eastern Prussia. The divisions from France were to help keep them at bay. But when they arrived, the decisive battle was already over, the Battle of Tannenberg. It was a victory for the German Empire. 90,000 Russian soldiers were taken prisoner. Masses of materials captured. Tannenberg was a personal victory for Paul von Hindenburg, who attained hero status. Refugees from eastern Prussia returned home.
Well, the Battle of Tannenberg was definitely a major German success, but you could ask the question, what was the strategic consequence of the victory of Tannenberg? And well, at this time of the year, in summer 1914, Germany have to win the campaign in France. So they must win in France, they must defeat France. So Tannenberg didn't change the strategic situation of Germany. In Tannenberg, the Germans did not defeat Russia. The war was going on the Eastern Front, and everybody was concentrated on the Western Front, waiting for a decisive victory there.
September the 3rd, 1914, the first German forces crossed the Marne. It's just 18 kilometers to Paris. The French government had already left the city, but the will to offer resistance remained unbroken. French soldiers even took taxis to go north towards the Marne River and the front. With massive forced marches, the British managed to catch up with the French. And it was imperative they did, because the battle at the Marne was to be decisive. The Western powers offered up everything they had, 1 million French and British soldiers against 750,000 Germans. But then an event occurred that the French call the miracle at the Marne. Following days of bloody battles, the Germans surprisingly pulled back, and had good reason to do so.
They didn't suddenly retreat. They were suddenly and overwhelmingly outnumbered and faced the very real threat of a massive military defeat. There were big gaps between the attacking units, which the opposition forces could exploit.
The decision by the German military leadership to send 2 army divisions to eastern Prussia was now exposed as disastrous. With such gaps on the front line, the German forces had lost touch with each other. The supply chain simply wasn't long enough. Eventually, an order came from the Imperial Supreme Command in Luxembourg to retreat to positions that are more easily defendable. It was the first serious German defeat in the war. September 1914, just 18 kilometers from Paris, the Battle of the Marne raged, with almost 2 million men involved. The last days of battle marked the end of mobile fighting in the West. Trench warfare now beckoned. The German dream of a quick victory over France was gone. The battle plan of the German Supreme Command had failed. The German people weren't informed about this. Leipzig, soldiers on leave from the front, a different world. War was still a boy's favorite game, far removed from the horror in France. On the front, the mass killings are now in full flow.
After a few weeks, they have to stop publishing the lists of the dead in newspapers because there are simply too many names. The families concerned are informed and they grieve, but I think that the first months of the war with these massive losses don't really register properly during the war.
Soldiers streamed to the front, anxious they might be too late to fight. In Flanders, the soldiers on both sides began to dig in. Trench warfare, barbed wire, communication trenches, and fortifications. At times, the enemies were positioned only meters from one another. Skilled trench building was paramount. They were the only safe havens from the monstrous artillery fire. Life in the death zone. Years spent here, even in this modern-day setting, could drive a man insane. October 1914. Faced with an unending line of entrenched German forces, Britain and France looked to take the offensive. With a mobile war planned, the Allied trenches were only intended to be temporary, and suffered accordingly. The entrenched German lines were better planned and built, with supply lines to match. But on both sides, the soldiers' experiences were similar: cold, wet, and dirty, and constantly close to death. Of 110,000 British soldiers who went to war in August 1914, 90,000 were either dead or wounded just a few months later. As some companies were made up from volunteers from the same towns, even streets, the death of a comrade was felt even more deeply. One can only imagine the bonds created and then broken by such an onslaught of terror. The horror of trench warfare was too much for many to bear. In November 1914, the Saxon Lieutenant Kurt Samisch noted in his diary, "Every day we now get French soldiers coming over to us because they can no longer cope with life in the trenches." The Western Front towards the end of 1914. A death zone several kilometers wide, running from the North Sea all the way to the Swiss border. But the lines remained static. By now, 1 million young men had lost their lives.
Well, in the end of 1914, the Germans had advanced a bit into France, when they conquered Belgium, advanced a bit into France, and they were able to stop the offensive of the Russian offensive in the east. They were able to defeat at least some Russian troops, but there was no final victory for the Germans. And you could also say, well, even the Entente, the Allies, were not able to defeat Germany either. The astonishing thing is nobody had a master plan.
1 million young men killed in the space of just 5 months. Millions upon millions of grieving wives, sisters, brothers, and parents, like the sculptress Kata Kollwitz and her husband. Their son Peter is buried in the cemetery of Władysław in Belgium. He was just 18 years old. That's how long Kata Kollwitz worked on these sculptures. A scar that would never quite heal, and should never quite heal, she wrote. Berlin, 1914, just before Christmas. Fathers and sons, certain they'd be home by Christmas, were absent. Many would never come home at all. This was not part of the plan. At no point in this war did as many soldiers die as in 1914. Christmas at the front, meals from the field kitchen rather than roast goose. Bitter reminders of a life no longer led as the freezing weather descended. Christmas Eve in Flanders. It was a clear night, the first for a long time. Saxon Lieutenant Kurt Samisch ordered that not a single shot should be fired, if at all avoidable. In British trenches too, a desire to recognize the day. Soon the opposing trenches were communicating, whistling and shouting to each other. Then, after some to and fro, the British and Germans put up lights. Eventually, the first dared to venture out of their trenches. First steps into the death zone. The British soldier Ernest Morley wrote, "The Germans approached us, and we walked towards them. We had the very bizarre pleasure to chat with the men who had been doing their best to kill us, and we them."
We have proof of over 30 cases around here, and in some cases it lasted for over 10 days into the new year. If the two units opposing each other and having a truce were staying there for quite a while, you notice that nobody is restarting the war again.
Photographs of a unique incident, something that would not be repeated in the coming years of the war. Amid the barbarity, a quiet revolt of humanity. It was the officers and troops at the front that kept the truce, but it could not last. Eventually, the commanders cracked down. The killing fields were once again open.
This slaughterhouse lasted for 4 long years and left a world behind it which was unrecognizable from that which had started the war in 1914. And the war which took place in 1939 to 1945 is unthinkable, really, without what happened in the First World War. That the disturbances that the First World War created, the social unrest, the economic mayhem that resulted from it, all this left unfinished business.
At the war's end, almost 40 million men were killed, wounded, or missing in action. The terror of mechanized warfare was here to stay. Ahead lay the horror of Ypres, the Somme, and the dreaded gas attacks. The First World War, a conflict that devoured men like no other. A new horror of automated fighting and killing. For the first time in history, death came en masse. When the guns finally fell silent, the world would never look the same again. World War I, the conflict that pitted 20th century war machines against 19th century tactics. The images of young men blindly walking into hails of machine gun fire summed up the barbarity of modern trench warfare. At its height, Millions threw their bodies against the might of cannon fire and bullet, all in the pursuit of a few yards gained. Over 4 cataclysmic years, the world's great powers, assembled in 2 opposing forces, waged war across the planet. 70 million military personnel were mobilized. New technology fueled the lethality of weapons, and without equivalent improvements in defense or tactics, the generals resorted to mass human wave attacks. By the war's end, almost 10 million military personnel had been killed. Whole nations mourned the dead, the missing, and disabled. Returning soldiers brought home with them severe mental trauma. Each nation involved has been scarred deeply, leaving a lasting impact on social memory. Such collective trauma destroyed optimism and created a turn for those that had fought in the war. The lost generation. These are the bare facts, remembered so they can't be forgotten. But within all this and amid such tumultuous times, the human element can get lost. Recently restored German archive, much of it never before seen, catapults us back and lifts the veil on the people and times where death was reduced to a mere blowing of a whistle. Some wars name themselves. This is the Great War. The war had now been raging for 2 years. Several million soldiers were fighting on the battlefields of Europe. By 1916, the German advance into France had long ground to a halt. The Western Front had turned into bitter, static trench warfare. French and German soldiers faced each other along a 700-kilometer front line, which included Verdun. The war swallowed up huge resources, both soldiers and materials. The Germans wanted to regain the advantage and planned an offensive at the Meuse River. The French were only too aware of what was at stake and took up their positions. But this war was like none other before. Now, death came from above.
The war in the area in 1916 takes a dramatically different turn, a turn that begins at Verdun right at the start of the year, because that is the moment when the German Air Force takes the decision to concentrate fighters into squadrons. And by doing that, to create areas of airspace which they are in control of for that period of time while the aircraft are in the air, which is part of the reason why the Germans can prepare the Verdun offensive in so much secrecy.
The aviators were tasked with a crucial assignment: to recce the military situation at Verdun from the air. Hundreds of pictures were taken. They deliver key intelligence on the enemy's size and positions. A chateau near Epernay, a safe distance from the front. Armed with photographs, the pilots are ushered into the highest military circles. The Kaiser's son, Crown Prince Wilhelm, commanded the local attacking forces. Chief of Staff von Falkenhayn bore the overall responsibility. Armed with this new intelligence, the German High Command now believed they'd pinpointed their opponent's weak spot. The Battle of Verdun had been raging since the 21st of February 1916. Thousands of German artillery pieces pounded the fortifications outside the town, clearing the way for the advancing infantry. Never before had such concentrations of artillery been unleashed in such a small area. The destruction was unprecedented.
This feeling of wanting to break through and force a decision remained a basic aspiration right until the end and continued to refresh fighting courage.
This war was unlike any other. Sheer numbers were the preferred military tactic. Both armies possessed a small proportion of professional soldiers fighting next to millions of young men from all walks of life, all lacking serious military experience. Technological progress now showed its cruel face. The area between the opposing trenches became known as the death zone. Symbolic of the Battle of Verdun would be its fortresses. Fort Douaumont was the biggest. After just a few days, the Germans managed to conquer it without difficulty. Not only was it the most strategic of all the fortresses, it was also the most modern in the defensive buffer zone protecting Verdun. The defeat was a massive shock to the French. Despite the static nature of the Western Front, in Verdun alone, thousands of French and German soldiers were taken prisoner as futile attempts to break through failed. Nobody was prepared for the tidal wave of POWs.
In the First World War, prisoners of war en masse are first. Suddenly, there are 100,000 captives. What could be done with all these people? There is no precedent. So they have to compromise. I have to say, despite all the cruelties that did take place, there is a substantial difference between the treatment of prisoners of war in World War I and World War II.
All in all, 8 million men were held in prisoner of war camps. The Hague Conventions ensured that survival rates were generally higher than those suffered at the front. The number of wounded and maimed reached hundreds of thousands. Modern technology attempted to repair the damage it had inflicted on the battlefield. Propaganda footage was released to reassure people that victims were well cared for.
It is true that this side of the war was made public. It wasn't hidden away. At times, the advertisement of prosthetics in German specialist journals and in the public newspapers goes so far that, to be sarcastic, one might be feeling a little jealous of the people who don't have a silly arm anymore, but instead a fabulous gripping tool, who can screw a hammer or pliers straight onto the prosthetic rather than having to cope with a cumbersome hand.
The films portray the maimed and crippled as still productive by contributing to the war effort.
They're doing well, don't worry. That's how people manage to cope with this appalling experience.
Initially, these pictures were kept from the public.
The French call this the gueule cassée, and the association of, in English, broken faces, is still very powerful in France, even today.
Broken faces, broken lives. The war had already destroyed so much in so little time. Ahead lay the horror of the battle for Verdun. Verdun, just 18 kilometers from Paris. German artillery reached as far as the town square. This city would be pivotal in how the Western Front was contested. Thousands fled, scenes that would become commonplace during the Second World War. The French feared the Germans could make a breakthrough and reach Paris within just a few weeks. It was imperative that positions were held at all costs. If Verdun fell, it was feared, so would France. Henri-Philippe Pétain, an experienced general, took overall control. For the flag, for victory. A French propaganda poster. Virtually every French soldier would fight at Verdun at some point during the war. Parisians had lived with the imminent threat of Germans overrunning their capital for 2 years. On the face of it, apparent normality continued. Women set the tone. With millions of men away fighting at the front, the needs of their families at home were well catered for. The people of France didn't starve, but that's only part of the story.
Chez ceux qui sont loin du front,
for civilians far removed from the front, daily routines become homogeneous. They continue with their normal activities, but that's deceptive. Even if you're in Marseille, you still have a father, a brother, or a son serving at the front. If you work in the fields, you're in a way feeding the war. If you're working in a factory, you're more than likely also working for the war. This apparent normality can be very misleading. The war is not physically here, but it's unlikely anybody can escape the war in these times.
In Germany, queuing for essentials, bread, butter, meat and vegetables. Many provisions went straight to the military. Even clothes were rationed. Early confidence in a quick, decisive German victory had evaporated.
This war is the new life. This is how our lives are going to be. We'll actually be all much more comfortable if we just accept that we're now a country at war and we have no prospect of it ever ending. And that way, we'll stop worrying. We'll stop having to calculate. We'll become resigned to our fates. We'll become institutionalized, really, as war-making nations. And I think the longer that goes on, the more that mood takes place and hope becomes extinguished.
Key to Germany's lack of resources was the British naval blockade. As early as 1914, the North Sea was declared a war zone. Only once did the German Navy attempt to challenge the British fleet. May the 31st, 1916. The two powers contested one of the largest naval battles in history at Skagerrak off Norway. The Battle of Jutland. The British far outnumbered the Germans, 150 ships against 100. In the end, neither side were victorious, but there were many casualties, over 6,000 British dead, with more than 2,500 on the German side. The Germans sank twice as many ships, but the blockade remained intact. In the face of British superiority, any further attempts to break through seemed pointless. For the German sailors, it was a time of inactivity. At the end of the war, they refused a combat mission ordered by the Kaiser and rebelled. The war was also proving to be a logistical nightmare behind the front line. Supplies of personnel, weapons and ammunition were deciding factors over winners and losers.
The logistical effort required to put this offensive in place is enormous, because what you're effectively having to do is to create roads where there are no roads, railways where there are no railways, and put in a system of telegraph communication which isn't in place necessarily either.
The front wasn't just a system of trenches and fortifications. The facilities needed to cater for the troops reached far behind the front line. There were field kitchens, bakeries, stables, and transport fleets, ammunition depots, and weapon arsenals. First aid stations were about 3 kilometers from the front. Field hospitals, about 20. Trains led almost to the front line, because every day they had to deliver enough provisions to look after an army equivalent to the population of a major city. Every battalion was a mirror image of society and all its professions. On the French side, everyday life behind the front line was also being documented. Alcohol is distributed to quell the soldiers' fear of the next assault. The war ate up more resources than any before it and required supplies on a sheer unimaginable scale. An enormous industrial undertaking involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers who must eat, sleep, and fight here.
The Battle of Verdun was so special because it was fought on a very small area. It was not the costliest battle of the First World War, but it was the battle fought on the smallest area. And in this very small, tiny area around Verdun, hundreds of thousands of soldiers fought, hundreds of thousands of soldiers died, and this small area around Verdun saw the first battle of attrition of the First World War.
Massive reserves of munitions were stockpiled, ready to plough up just a few square kilometers of ground, and turned the battlefield into a living hell. The French company commander Jacques Delvert commented in his diary, "Modern warfare is no longer a man-to-man fight. The enemy is everywhere. Its deadly ammunition rains from the sky. Modern weapons turn once honorable combat into a senseless slaughter. This battle has already been raging for 100 days. The trench warfare is wearing my men down. We should end this war as soon as possible." A young Frenchman wrote in his letter from the front, "15 days in Verdun have drained and demoralized us, more than 6 months in the trenches before." Millions of letters from the front reach families at home, but increasingly they bring news of deaths, of battle wounds and maimings, of farewells and lost hope. There was no safe place on the battlefield. Death now came from the air. Reconnaissance aircraft became fighter planes, which then developed into bombers. Cameras were exchanged for machine guns and explosives. But contrary to the battles on the ground, this was still an apparently gallant war.
They're looking for duels, in a way almost like a step back to the Middle Ages, where you would also try to compete with each other during a personal dispute. That's the difference to the soldiers in the trenches.
But despite the romantic notions, these skirmishes were harbingers of a war that only decades later would obliterate entire cities. The war of the bombers. For now, These were isolated attacks involving just a few hundred aircraft, but new aviation technology still delivered terror from the skies. Airships pushed far into enemy airspace from Paris to London. These attacks, with little strategic benefit, were designed to spread fear amongst the population. But the First World War was fought mainly on the ground, and the battle for Verdun was reaching a crucial stage. Early summer 1916. The battle for Verdun had reached a decisive point, and a grueling jostling for position around Fort Vaux ensued. June the 1st, 1916. A full-on assault of Fort Vaux commenced. A German senior lieutenant of the 50th Infantry Division noted, "The great day has arrived. We're going to attack Fort Vaux. Just before the attack, all doubts disappear, and our duty to our holy fatherland wins out."
If you compare less than 30 years later, what happens at Stalingrad, for example, that battle is the same genus, if you like. The big difference is it's taking place in a city, which I think is one of the big contrasts between the First and the Second World Wars, is that cities become battlegrounds because people realize the defensive capabilities of a city, even in a semi-destroyed or totally destroyed state. But the weapon systems that are being used in the Second World War are weapon systems that, broadly speaking, reached their maturity in the First World War and are being fought by armies of comparable size and scale.
The First World War is infamous as the conflict which introduced chemical weapons to the battleground. Their effects, too horrendous to imagine and too unpredictable to control. In early skirmishes, tear gas was used, but to little real effect. Then, far more lethal substances were introduced. Special German units were formed, and artillery grenades filled with the lethal substances. The soldiers died agonizing deaths. Survivors suffered from terrible chemical burns. The threat of chemical warfare spread far amongst the people of Verdun. They fashioned makeshift masks from wet cloth. But these children wouldn't have survived a serious attack. Gas was also used during the battle for Fort Vaux. The Germans advanced with flamethrowers, step by step. Shortly before the surrender, the fortress's French commander noted, "All communications with the outside world have collapsed. The battle for the fortress is dreadful. The suffering of the wounded is horrendous. We are defeated through exhaustion and thirst." The survivors of Fort Vaux were taken into German captivity. In total, about 8 million soldiers were taken prisoner during the Great War. The Hague Convention of 1907 formed the basis of their treatment. It decreed prisoners should be treated with humanity, and with regards to food, quarters, and clothes, there should be no distinction from one's own troops. But faced with huge numbers of prisoners, the military powers were often unable to cope. During the first winter, there were mass deaths across Europe. There are 2.5 million inmates from 13 different countries in German camps alone. In contrast to captured officers, foot soldiers were put to work, most of them as agricultural laborers. For security reasons, operations essential to the war effort were excluded from the force's labor.
All powers use their prisoners of war that they're allowed to use as labor. Are they significant? Nothing like to the same extent as in the Second World War. It's not in the same deliberate exploitation of this manpower as a resource in the way in which you get in the Second World War. On the other hand, it happens. I mean, this is the beginning of a process.
Some prisoners were released early, especially the wounded and the sick. These are exchanged German soldiers on their way back home. Across Europe, keeping the wartime economy going was now the preserve of women. In Britain alone, 2 million women took up jobs previously held by men. In France, every 5th woman went out to work. It was also women who looked after the destitute and veterans. In Britain, archive footage shows an attempt to entertain those convalescing.
There is often a strong contrast made between the experiences of the soldier at the front and a civilian world which knows nothing of what the war is about, and which lives in a sort of fantasy world, still going to the theatre, still going to restaurants, still relaxing, behaving as though there isn't a war on.
But for soldiers who had recovered from their injuries, life at the front beckoned once more.
Most of those in uniform are citizens in uniform. They're temporary soldiers. They're not career soldiers. These are people who are going to return from the war and take up their previous occupations, whether they were peasants or factory workers or clerks or lawyers. They're going to go back to doing those sorts of things.
Early summer 1916, the British mobilized hundreds of thousands of soldiers for an offensive in support of the French at the Somme, a river basin 250 kilometers to the north of the battles raging around Verdun. The German occupiers had more than a year to dig themselves in and fortify their positions here. The calm before the storm. These reconstructed scenes were to show life in the trenches during lulls in the fighting. By June 1916, there were 20 British and 11 French divisions stationed at the Somme. On the German side, only half that number. In the end, almost 2.5 million soldiers would be fighting here. This was the first battle to be documented extensively on film. British camera teams followed the troops on their way to the front. At the Somme, there was to be a change in battle plans. Before the British infantry launched their attack, artillery was to clear the way with a barrage lasting several days. The British High Command were confident that this tactic would secure the upper hand. British Commander-in-Chief Douglas Haig stated, "The infantrymen simply have to walk over and occupy the German trenches." It was a bold statement based on hard facts. In the following 7 days, 1.5 million shells were to be targeted on just a thin strip of German-held land. June 1916, the Somme. 2.5 million soldiers faced each other. 1,500 Allied artillery pieces targeted their firepower on just a narrow strip of German line. June the 24th, the barrage began. In just 7 days and nights, 1.5 million shells were delivered. The German author Ernst Junger later wrote, "There was artillery fire of unimaginable power that thundered and roared ahead of us. 1,000 flashes enveloped the western horizon like a sea of flames. There was a constant stream of the wounded, returning with bloodless, sunken faces.
Quand on est bombardé, on est totalement impuissant. L'expérience du bombardement, c'est une expérience extrêmement traumatique.
When you're being bombarded, you're completely helpless. The experience is extremely traumatizing. Why? Because you could die at any moment, and you witness the deaths of your comrades all around you. So the bombardments cause trauma in the survivors, who ask themselves, why them? Why not me?
New, puzzling clinical symptoms began to emerge. Shell shock sufferers. Initially, they were suspected of simulating their condition.
The war physicians decided they were simply particularly shrewd shirkers and treated these people with horrendous forced methods, tied down electroshocks they didn't know.
July the 1st, 1916, the British infantry at the Somme attacked the German lines. They believed the enemy positions had been obliterated by the fierce artillery bombardment. But it was a fallacy. It took just a few machine gunners and cannons to kill 8,000 British soldiers in just half an hour.
They can't retreat either, because the guards in the trenches would shoot them immediately. Soldiers know this. There's no return for them.
These men, with minimal training, faced near certain death, either mown down by German machine gun fire or shot by one of their own. On the German side, their trenches withstood the massive artillery bombardment because their fortifications were several meters deep. But above ground, it was pure devastation. The Battle of the Somme was a gruesome testament to how military commanders clung to outdated tactics. Again and again, General Haig ordered his troops to attack the German positions.
If you lose nearly 20,000 dead and nearly 40,000 wounded in a single day, of course, the experience of the Somme was traumatic. The effects were traumatic in certain battalions, and they were felt throughout, those effects throughout British society, because those battalions were very often so-called PALS battalions that had been locally recruited, and very often whole platoons, sections had come from the same streets in the same cities.
With over 1 million dead, wounded and missing on both sides, this was the most costly battle of the First World War.
The Battle of the Somme is really the iconic moment for Britain in terms of its understanding of its own military history in the 20th century. It's the example to avoid. It's what every British general in the Second World War has not to do. And it's also a definition of what can happen if you have a continental outlook on war. This is what European war can be like if you misinterpret it and get it wrong. So it has a very profound long-term effect.
German field hospitals were overflowing with thousands of wounded soldiers. Bielitz, near Berlin. Here, a certain dispatch runner had come to convalesce. Adolf Hitler.
Hitler said the regiment was his home, and he never felt anywhere as much at home as he did in the regiment. Here he had some sort of community and he wanted to get back to it.
What Hitler found was a reflection of the discontent brewing at the front. With the cannon fire still ringing in their ears and the experience of total war fresh in their minds, the convalescing soldiers expressed the horror of what they'd seen in the trenches. Gone was the fervor of war, replaced by a wish for the killing and utter barbarity to stop. For Hitler, it was a shock to be faced by such anti-war sentiment.
And he hated the what he saw, the defeatism and the shirking and the malingering that he saw when he went to Berlin.
In Germany, initial enthusiasm for the war had long since turned into bitter disillusionment. Hitler's love for the military stood out against a backdrop of mistrust and hatred for the military high command. The national mood was becoming more and more strained. There were mass protests and widespread hardship. A resident of Augsburg wrote, "I often don't know whether I'm coming or going. You're supposed to cook. Everyone is hungry, and you have nothing to give them." More and more children became malnourished. Many die. The government was facing heavy criticism. The Kaiser tried to appease with symbolic gestures.
If we stand today in front of the German parliament in Berlin, we see the inscription Dem deutschen Volke, for the German people. And this inscription was made in the end of 1916 to offer the starving German people and suffering German people something. I mean, the German people had no political power. There was no real democracy at this time. They were starving. It was quite a bad situation of the German people, and there was also no hope to gaining political power. So this inscription was so a symbol from the authorities to offer at least a hope to the German people that they might get in the future more political power.
For 2 long years, Germany had been fighting a war on 2 fronts. In the east, the battlefield was more fluid. Russia was forced to relinquish large tracts of land. The war here was still on the move and hadn't ground to a halt in the trenches. The opponents were trying to encircle one another in pincer movements. The Russian army suffered from supply breakdowns, shortages of ammunition and food, which demoralized the soldiers. But in the summer of 1916, a wave of Russian attacks, closely coordinated with the Western Allies, applied pressure on the enemy lines. And there was a change of tactics. The Russian General Brusilov no longer sent his soldiers unprotected into the line of German machine gun fire. He now prepared his attacks carefully, with artillery barrages. The German High Command reacted and withdrew 100,000 soldiers from the Western Front to be transferred to the east.
The Brusilov offensive is absolutely the Eastern Front's contribution to the overall Allied strategy of convergent attacks on all fronts simultaneously to pull the Germans in 3 directions at once. So the Brusilov offensive fulfills its role. And in fact, it's the Brusilov offensive that really provides the relief for the French at Verdun.
Prisoner of war camps on the Eastern Front. Hundreds of thousands were held captive. German POWs were taken to Moscow and St. Petersburg to parade in front of the public. More than 100,000 German soldiers were deported to Siberia. 1 in every 5 men did not return. For the whole of Russia, the war in the East had immense repercussions.
Parts of it are very bloody. It's a slaughter, not the least because the civilian population is more involved.
It wasn't only the Russian soldier who went hungry, but his family and entire cities. Resentment grew, while the nobility and the Tsar's family lived lives of luxury. The war deepened the chasm between the ruler and his people. It was fertile breeding ground for rampant political discontent. Within a year, the Russian Revolution would topple the Tsar's regime. Kaiser Wilhelm II, he too, was living on borrowed time. The war would also wipe him and his family from power. But that was to come later. The Great War was entering its decisive, bloody stage. Germany, in a final desperate attempt to break through the Western Front, would throw everything they had into one last monstrous assault. And on the horizon, a new fighting force with weapons to match: the Americans. The First World War, a conflict that devoured men like no other. A new horror of automated fighting and killing. For the first time in history, death came en masse. When the guns finally fell silent, the world would never look the same again. World War I, the conflict that pitted 20th century war machines against 19th century tactics. The images of young men blindly walking into hails of machine gun fire summed up the barbarity of modern trench warfare. At its height, millions threw their bodies against the might of cannon fire and bullet, all in the pursuit of a few yards gained. Over 4 cataclysmic years, the world's great powers, assembled in 2 opposing forces, waged war across the planet. 70 million military personnel were mobilized. New technology fueled the lethality of weapons, and without equivalent improvements in defense or tactics, the generals resorted to mass human wave attacks. By the war's end, almost 10 million military personnel had been killed. Whole nations mourned the dead, the missing, and disabled. Returning soldiers brought home with them severe mental trauma. Each nation involved has been scarred deeply, leaving a lasting impact on social memory. Such collective trauma destroyed optimism and created a turn for those that had fought in the war. The lost generation. These are the bare facts, remembered so they can't be forgotten. But within all this and amid such tumultuous times, the human element can get lost. Recently restored German archive, much of it never before seen, catapults us back and lifts the veil on the people and times where death was reduced to a mere blowing of a whistle. Some wars name themselves. This is the Great War. The German headquarters in the Belgian resort of Spa. Here, General Paul von Hindenburg and General Erich Ludendorff planned a massive offensive for the 21st of March 1918. After 4 grueling years, the aim was to break free from the shackles of trench warfare. Its code name, Operation Michael. Since the German invasion of 1914, the war had quickly ground to a halt to the east of Paris. 1 million soldiers faced each other, Germans in the east, French and British to the west, with the front line barely moving. In this destructive war of attrition, the land between the rivers Somme and Marne had been ripped asunder. Even today, the ground bears the scars of bombs and grenades. By the beginning of 1918, over 1.5 million men had perished in the War of the Trenches. The German frontline soldier placed all his hopes in this massive onslaught. A German lieutenant later remembered, "We're about to make history," they told us. "We were convinced that the attack ahead was in the end going to bring the war to a victorious close."
The ordinary German soldier always tried to make sense of the war, because it was quite a disastrous situation in the trenches, without food, the danger of being killed and so on and so on. This for years, no end in sight. So they tried to make sense, and in spring 1918 there was the big hope with a last offensive, a final offensive. They might win the war and then there's peace. So a situation in spring 1918 was that they said, well, let's stay together, let's have one last effort, one last chance to end this endless war.
Even at the heart of the German Reich, the spring of 1918 brought renewed hope. It was fueled purely by a longing for the war to end. The German people had suffered from forced austerity. The empire was creaking under the pressure of total all-out war. Over 13 million men were in military service. And the women had been left to master daily life at home and in the munitions factories.
During the war, the state developed new powers over the civilian populations, powers of mobilization, powers of organization, economic controls, and so on. And the idea of this being a total war, a total effort, then emerged out of the First World War.
The collective exertion provoked a sense of war weariness and dissent. At the start of the year, hundreds of thousands went on strike. It was a protest against misery, disease, and hunger. Further east, widespread discontent in the Russian Empire had led to the October Revolution, which toppled the Tsar's reign in 1917. A communist regime under Lenin's leadership had taken its place. The newly installed leaders acted decisively by putting an end to the war. On the Eastern Front, yesterday's enemies became allies. In Brest-Litovsk in Western Russia, Germany and the Central Powers demanded tough conditions for a peace treaty. This freed the German Reich from the grip of a two-pronged war, allowing them to concentrate fully on the planned attack in the West. It also freed up 200,000 fresh soldiers, as the Private Dominic Richard remembered. Train after train rolled towards the West, filled with soldiers and war materials. They thought the armies freed up in Russia would break through the English-French front line and gain victory, despite everything.
Behind all of this was the thought on the German side that they had to force the collapse of the French and British armies before the Americans could reach the front with all their might. In this sense, the whole thing was, of course, an act of desperation.
In America, there were deep reservations about entering the war, but the sinking of 7 merchant ships and Germany's allegiance to Mexico led America to declare war on Germany on April the 6th, 1917. In a frenzied period of mobilization, the US Army grew from 100,000 recruits to 4 million. Before long, half of them were disembarking on French shores. What they lacked in battle experience was compensated by a ready supply of goods and a fresh fighting spirit.
The American Expeditionary Force suffers, as the British Expeditionary Force suffered in 1914, from going from a very low base point, from being a very small army to creating a mass army for continental war in a very short space of time. Now, what that means is you can bring manpower in very quickly. You can bring in untrained manpower very quickly. Can you produce a trained and effective army? That is why the British in particular say we need to brigade American units with British units.
From the very beginning, America had put its faith in a new generation of weapons, tanks. The static nature of trench warfare and the need to break through heavily fortified lines led to their increasing importance. These were the early days of a machine that would come to dominate the battlefield. Despite mechanical failures and their ungainly nature, tanks were deployed as early as 1916 at the Somme, with varied success. Although tank brigades managed to break through, military leaders failed to coordinate their attacks. This meant ground gained was quickly lost, as troops behind were too slow to defend the advances. The introduction of the tank to the World War I battlefield heralded the start of mechanized, modern warfare.
It was a war of machines, the first great war of machines in history. And the situation of men versus machines really arose. That was really a new thing. Even just the massive amounts of artillery clustered together. That had never happened before. The first tanks were deployed, and the machine gun could substitute an entire company of infantry. Airplanes of all kinds, Zeppelins, and U-boats in the war at sea. All this led to the fact that this war turned into a gigantic battle of materials and weapons.
Killing on an industrial scale. Humans reduced to ant-like status. For Operation Michael, Germany had amassed over 1 million grenades, earmarked just for the initial phase of the planned battle. After 4 grueling years of trench warfare, one last throw of the dice, in just a few short weeks, 6,600 artillery pieces and 3,500 mortars would be let loose in a hail of death. Early March 1918. Behind German lines, a staggering array of munitions were being readied. Supply lines had delivered over 1 million grenades and 10,000 artillery pieces. In just a few short weeks, Operation Michael would unleash a hellish conflagration. But there was a problem. Despite the stockpiles of munitions, success could only be achieved with a rapid breakthrough. But with the battlefront so stretched, no amount of bombardment could be pinpointed to cause maximum damage. This was a clear sign that battle tactics had improved little over 4 long years. The front line was now riddled with mile after mile of trenches. For the soldier stationed on the Western Front, the choices were bleak. A week before the push, a German soldier wrote, "Dying by the bullet doesn't seem hard, but to be torn apart, hacked to pieces, and pulped is a fear that the flesh cannot cope with."
The stalemate of trench warfare is the failure of all the military strategy up to that day. And they have no answer to that. And so they just keep on doing whatever they think is best. And the political leaders don't have the courage nor the alternative to stop it.
A French artilleryman expressed his doubts. What are we sacrificing ourselves for? If they could at least tell us that, and not fob us off with speeches. From our perspective, we will not gain victory over the Germans, and it's the same the other way round. Further north, positions were held by soldiers from right across the British Empire.
The mood on the Allied side of the line is pretty depressed, pretty low, particularly from the British point of view. The British Army has no real sense of imminent victory. In fact, if anything, the reverse. The expectation is, can they hold? Particularly when they don't know where the Michael offensive will be launched, which sector of the front. And of course, in the early part of the month, the Germans themselves haven't decided where it will be.
In the German lines, unbroken sleep was a luxury few could afford. A mixture of abject fear and restlessness permeated the trenches. Sergeant Max Schultz wrote, "The commander gave a speech. We were to participate in a great attack. It would be the last decisive battle. We trusted our generals and believed what he said. I thought of my parents and prayed that God would guide me through this thing in one piece." "4:40 a.m., March the 21st, the German barrage began. 6,600 artillery pieces and 3,500 mortars pulverized 70 kilometers of front line with resounding success. A British captain witnessed the carnage unfolding around him. Achilles left a youth and returned an old man. He never recovered from this shock. On the 21st of March, he became a human wreck and could no longer be used as a soldier.
On the morning of the 21st of March 1918, the German attack started. The German artillery barrage on the British lines, on the French lines, and then the German stormtroopers attacked. And very much to the German surprise, the German stormtroopers suffered very, very heavy casualties. The British artillery was firing back. It was, I think, one of the costliest days in the First World War for the German side. So thousands of German soldiers getting killed, mainly by artillery. And artillery was the deadliest weapon in the First World War. 56% of German soldiers died due to artillery. And it was also, a new impact on the soldier, something which was then up to then unknown. It was then given the name of shell shock.
A British private described the effects. nobody can cope with a barrage for more than 3 hours without being completely worn down and deadened to it. It's a little like paralyzation. After that, when the enemy come over, they can do anything to you. I think we were sacrificed. German soldier Dominik Richert was among the attackers. Everyone got ready with a pounding heart. We left the protection of the home. Everywhere was brimming with German soldiers pushing forward. Along the line, the Germans managed to push 5 kilometers further west. But the price was unbelievably high. Almost 18,000 British and German soldiers died on a single day. After 4 years of stalemate, military commanders from both sides had failed to come up with an alternative battle plan. Again and again, the only tactic available was to throw an unending wave of human bodies into the killing fields. The German Supreme Command celebrated the start of the so-called Kaiser battle. Kaiser Wilhelm II awarded the highest Prussian military decoration to his strategist Ludendorff. The newly decorated general proclaimed victory after just 4 days. In response, the Kaiser granted the children of Germany a day off school. The hope for a speedy campaign gained ground in the German Reich. The spirit of 1914 was again being evoked. The promise of a quick victory dangled as a carrot. A German corporal wrote home, "The daily pushes forward are encouraging and invigorating for the soldiers' disposition, which had dried up in the overly long trench warfare." The German offensive pushed 60 kilometers westward. The front was stretched, but they did not break through. The Germans had at least managed to fight their way out of their frozen positions further than ever since 1914. "90,000 Allied soldiers were taken prisoner. The French capital was now within reach of German artillery and bombers. Parisians, fearful of imminent attack, were desperate for the latest updates on battles being fought just a short drive away.
For civilians in a number of countries, this was the first time really that the war had been felt by the population. The population had now been mobilized for war in a way that had never been done before. And ordinary people were aware now of the war, not just in the fact that their fathers or brothers were away at the front, but also the impact it was having on their ordinary lives. Women being conscripted for civilian work, driving buses or trams and things, working in munitions factories. All these sorts of things meant that the war now became a civilian war.
Women and children fled Paris, not least due to the lack of food and basic provisions. The German gains offered the bounty of newly conquered food depots, which were plundered mercilessly. But the celebrations were premature. the advance had not turned into a breakthrough.
So the Germans attacked in March 1918, and they punched a hole through the British lines, and they advanced. They pushed the British and the French soldiers back, but there was no final victory. So, and this was the problem of the whole offensive. The whole idea was a last battle, a last attack, and then the final victory. But this never happened.
The great offensive had faltered. The Allied lines had held. For the Germans, ahead lay only retreat and humiliation. April 1918. Operation Michael had failed to break through Allied lines. The last great German advance had faltered. Despite early successes, the German army lacked the supplies to secure their gains. By comparison, the Allied forces were now better equipped. The newly arrived US Army was constantly expanding its stocks of people and machines. But the battle was still far from over. Early summer. With the backup of air support, the German army launched 4 further offensives along sections of the front line. The fighting raged to excess. German private Dominic Richert reported, "Up in the air, there are a number of fierce dogfights which end in 2 planes crashing to the ground in flames. These pilots die a 3-fold hero's death. First they are shot dead, then they burn, and at the end they even smash to pieces on the ground." It was the era of the flying ace. Lauded for their aerial prowess and sense of gallantry, the greatest of these was Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron. German propaganda proclaimed him as a model knight of the skies. He took to the air for the last time on the 21st of April, 1918. Hit from the ground, Richthofen crash-landed. He was so highly revered, British officers buried him with military honors. The German advance had now halted, and they were forced into defensive positions. July the 18th, the Allies launched a counterstrike. With British and American help, 13 French divisions pushed the Germans back towards the east. On the 8th of August, the Germans suffered their worst losses. It became known as the Black Day of the German army. As a result, there were the first signs of disintegration. The number of German prisoners increased dramatically. Private Dominic Richert, "If we could only put this mess behind us," was the universal wish. "I had only one thought, to be captured. At least then your life would be safe."
The German soldiers in spring 1918 agreed it's worthwhile to have a last offensive. It makes sense to have a last offensive, a last battle. We must stand together to achieve the final victory. So let's come on, final battle. But then they saw they suffered so many casualties, and they were not able to make it. Britain was not going to surrender, France was not going to surrender, and they saw, I mean, we tried everything. It's pointless. It's absolutely pointless. We can't make it. The war is lost.
A French officer described the prisoners. "They don't talk at all. They're so weak they don't even complain anymore. There is an immense sense of deep pain in their eyes." The German headquarters at the Belgian resort of Spa. In these far-removed surroundings, the reality of life at the front was largely ignored. The incredible suffering caused by the war altered little the daily routine here. Imperial chief strategists Hindenburg and Ludendorff continued their campaign unperturbed, as if unaware of any setbacks. New battle plans were produced, which in turn were passed to the fighting troops. On the Allied side, the build-up of a new fighting force. The Germans could no longer ignore the unmistakable truth. The US Army was rapidly becoming a significant opposition.
Had the U.S. not become involved in this war, the end would have not been in sight, because France and Great Britain had by now also reached a point where they weren't really able to defeat the Germans anymore. So this standoff could have carried on without end. The involvement of the USA had the decisive impact on the balance of power.
September 1918. The time had come for the US tank divisions to engage the enemy. At the Allied offensive near Saint-Mihiel to the south of Verdun, 144 tanks were pressed into action. Battle tactics issued for the tank were simple. As long as it was maneuverable, it had to push forward. Its presence would save the lives of hundreds of infantrymen. For the tank-supported US troops, the Battle of Saint-Mihiel became their first independently achieved success. And it would not be their last. Although US forces were not immune to devastating losses, they were resupplying the front to the tune of 10,000 men a day. What faced them when they arrived was a war like no other. Both sides were prepared to use any means available. By 1918, the use of poison gas reached its climax. A third of all ammunition was filled with the gas, which paralyzed breathing and corroded the lungs. A French officer witnessed the war-weary German soldiers who now surrendered in droves. They're emaciated, sometimes led by an officer who got away. They walk or stagger forward, supporting each other almost as if drunk. Head down, with a dark expression, their clothes as crusty as their faces.
If you've spent years in this meat grinder, the point would come when you would say, I just want to save my life now. It was noticeable that thousands of German soldiers went into captivity without putting up much resistance. That hadn't been the case before.
The number of German captives in the West climbed to over 500,000. Private Dominic Richert expressed his deepest fears in a journal entry. I think about how sad it would be if after all this awful, terrible stuff I was forced to participate in, I would still die here. I once read, "Our soldiers die for their fatherland with a smile on their faces." What a brazen lie. Who would want to smile, faced by such a dreadful death? All those who come up with such speeches should be sent to the front line. In reality, there's no sign of courage. Mortal fear takes over all other feelings, and it's only under this terrible pressure that the soldiers push forward. I don't think there's a single man here who would stay at the front of his own free will. They couldn't have cared less about the fatherland and would have just been desperate to save themselves. Shortly after, Dominic Richert saved his own life by fleeing into captivity. In the German Reich, there were few illusions left about the war. Hunger shortages and epidemics like Spanish flu killed almost twice as many here as all the bombs in World War II. The end of the German Empire was nearing, but the manner of their surrender would shock even the most hardened of supporters. August the 13th, 1918, a dark day for the German High Command. At their headquarters in the Belgian resort of Spa, General Ludendorff shocked politicians and the General Staff with an admission of failure. His staff officer reported, "The effect on the listeners was indescribable. While Ludendorff spoke, you could hear muted groans and sobs. Many, probably most, had tears streaming down their cheeks."
For a long time, Ludendorff didn't show his feelings. The only things that were noticeable were his tension and his temper tantrums. Only in September 1918 did he suddenly confront the political leadership with the realization the war is lost. We're going to have to negotiate a truce immediately. Hindenburg, too, argues that parties should take over the political power, that the civilians, and in particular the democratic parties, should face the music so that the military leadership would not be tainted by the odium of the defeat.
Democratic politician Philipp Scheidemann, who until recently had been reviled as unpatriotic, now became the administrator of a war policy that had one aim: to negotiate the best possible terms of surrender. In November, mutinous sailors in Kiel sparked a widespread revolt by soldiers and workers against the ailing monarchy. Under pressure from the revolution, and as part of the surrender terms, the German Kaiser was eventually forced to abdicate. On the 9th of November, the Social Democrat Scheidemann declared Germany to be a republic. The last rites of Imperial Germany had been read.
Es lebe das Neue! Es lebe die Deutsche Republik!
November the 11th, 1918, in a lounge car in Compiègne near Paris, representatives of the new German democracy signed the truce on behalf of the German Reich. The German military, conspicuous by their absence, hoped to preserve their legacy by not being present. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the ceasefire came into effect. The question remains, though, why didn't the Allies administer the final coup de grace against the German army?
Well, we only know that the decision not to invade Germany in 1918 is going to have the effects it had with hindsight. And of course, some people were able to anticipate what might come, that Germany wouldn't feel the full force of military defeat as a consequence of the decision to stop short. What we have to remember is that by the autumn of 1918, the Allies logistically had run out of the capability to continue the advance.
Silence had finally descended on the battlefields of Europe. A German soldier gave his impressions of the truce. All of a sudden, it stopped. There was deadly silence. We felt like newborns. The sun was out, and the world was green. We regained hope. We would go home. On both sides of the front line, the soldiers could finally prepare to go home. A few days after the armistice, French troops arrived in Alsace-Lorraine, an area bitterly disputed by both France and Germany. To avoid any future conflicts, the Allies created a buffer zone by occupying the region to the left of the Rhine, as well as the shorelines opposite Mainz, Koblenz, and Cologne. But uppermost in people's minds was sheer relief that the mass killing had at last come to an end. A French soldier wrote to his parents, "So much pain is mixed with elation that one would like to cry. The soldier has lost his inner peace. They cannot yet imagine that this terrible fighting has really come to an end." An entire generation would carry permanent physical and mental scars of this war. Across the killing fields of Europe, almost 70 million military personnel had waged war. In its wake, over 35 million casualties, either killed, wounded, or missing in action.
$10 million killed in the First World War, another 5 million in the aftermath of it, and famines and further fighting and so on. And violence directed against civilian populations then reached levels that had never been seen before. We've seen a third of the deaths in the First World War were civilian deaths, 2/3, I think, in the Second World War or something. So in this sense, it was an era that was characterized by violence.
It's said that insanity is repeating the same mistakes and expecting different results. The tactics employed on the Western Front reflect exactly that. For the returning soldiers, the harrowing experience of trench warfare and the repeated failures of the military leaders left scars that would be taken to the grave. The period immediately after World War I was a time of massive change. Empires that once ruled with absolute power had now crumbled. At the start of the war, 5 major imperial powers controlled vast tracts of Europe. By war's end, only the British Empire remained intact. The German, Russian, Austrian-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires had all been wiped from the face of Europe. The Paris Peace Conference imposed treaties on the vanquished Central Powers, confirming the end of hostilities. In signing the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was forced to accept responsibility for all the loss and damage to which the Allied and associated governments and their nationals have been subjected as a consequence of the war imposed upon them by the aggression of Germany and her allies. This caused enormous resentment in Germany, which nationalists, especially the Nazis, would exploit. But that horror was to come later. The tragedy of the Great War of 1914 to 18 is not that great nations died or millions perished in abject misery. It is that in its aftermath, an even greater massacre unfolded.